All right, everyone, we will starting our ATSEA webinar series very soon. So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to all of you in this our third day of the ATSEA-2 SPF consultative webinar series. And I would like to extend my warmest greeting to the regional steering committee members and representative of Arafura and Timor Sea countries from Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and also Australia. And of course, the distinguished participants here today with us. So welcome to the Arafura and Timor Sea Ecosystem Action Phase 2, or we call ATSEA-2 Stakeholder Partnership Forum, a consultative webinar series to building ATS for tomorrow. So this webinar series in a collaboration with GEF, UNDP, and PAMC. So as we begin our third day session, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Kirana Agustina, you can call me Kiran, and I'm currently working as a policy and engagement specialist at the Global Plastic Action Partnership at the World Resources Institute Indonesia, supporting the national target in reducing 70% of ocean plastic pollution by 2025. And I'm here very pleased and honored to be with all of you and be part of the all-woman scientist moderator in this ATSEA webinar. And I hope you've been enjoying the webinar series since day one. Not forget to mention that tomorrow is the last day, and I encourage you to attend the fourth day webinar tomorrow morning about sustainable fisheries, moderated by my dear colleague Mbak Yunita from the CTI CFF Women Leaders Forum. So coming back to our webinar today, the theme is about sustaining ecosystem services in ATS region, focusing on biodiversity protection, and we will learn from the two expert speakers, Dr. Alison Green and Dr. Nicolas Pilcher, followed by the two panelists, Dr. Alan White and Dr. Ida Bagus Windia Adnyana from the Udayana University, who will provide further feedbacks and after the speaker presentation. And just to remind everyone for housekeeping rules, the host will mute all participants in the event. So for those who would like to ask questions, please raise your hands. And the moderator, which is me, will call your name. So please also rename your name with name _ your institution so that we can know you better and make it more relatable to everyone here. And also do not hesitate to put your question in the chat box. And another exciting news, we are having daily quiz and quote competition. So on the quote competition, one participant is allowed to write down maximum 2 questions posted in our in your Facebook account. So please take ATSEA Facebook, and the winner will categorize based on the best quote about the ATSEA-2 project and the most liked post. And we will announce the winner at the fourth day of the webinar, which is tomorrow. So please stay tuned. And also there will be ATSEA questionnaire related to the comms and SPF that will be shared in the chat box by the committee and the host. So we will highly appreciate it to all of you to also fill in the form. And to remind everyone again that this also share and being lively recording in the YouTube, so you can feel free to share to your colleagues as well. So yeah, bring your tea, coffee, and notes for write down any inspiring quotes and highlight from today's discussion. And we will have a quote, and then yeah, let's start the discussion, this session. And without further ado, I will invite Ms. Cassandra Tania, the ATSEA-2 Regional Biodiversity Specialist, and also to deliver an introduction about today's webinar, the role, the Stakeholder Partnership Forum, the ATSEA, and why we need to protect this unique marine biodiversity and ocean landscapes. So, hello, Ms. Cassandra Tania, hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kiran, and good afternoon, country representatives from Australia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste, regional steering committee members, and all participants. Thank you for joining us in our third SPF consultative webinar series on a very interesting theme on marine biodiversity protection. On ATSEA-2 behalf, I will briefly introduce our program, the Arafura and Timor Seas Ecosystem Action Phase 2, or ATSEA-2, our soon-to-be developed Stakeholder Partnership Forum, or SPF, and also today's theme. Can I ask the EO to please share my screen. Yes, great. Next slide, please. And I will start my presentation by playing a short video that nicely summarizes
the
our program.
Arafura and Timor Seas region, or ATS, is unique in terms of its ecology, geography, and socio-political structure. It is rich in resources and home to a vast array of natural wonders. Shared by Australia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste, this fertile corridor of tropical water connects the Pacific and Indian Oceans. This area provides the peoples of many nations with essential resources, while also stocking the world's oceans with biodiversity. Unfortunately, overfishing, marine and land-based pollution, loss of habitat, and the impacts of climate change create a major threat to most marine life in the region. This underlines the urgent need for a collective regional action and transboundary management of economically important fish species, critical habitats, and marine megafauna. Therefore, in 2006, the ATS Expert Forum developed and submitted a bid to the Global Environment Facility, which came to be known as the Arafura and Timor Seas Ecosystem Action Program, or ATSEA. The initial phase was officially launched in 2010 and created a regional collaboration tasked with finding sustainable solutions for problems affecting coastal and marine resources in the region. In 2019, the second phase of ATSEA, known as ATSEA-2, has been adapted to take the collaboration and coordination in the ATS region a step further through the endorsement and implementation of a 10-year vision for the ATS, known as the Strategic Action Program. It is made up of three main components. The first component focuses on strengthening the regional and national collaboration mechanism and establishing a stakeholder partnership forum to facilitate implementation of priority actions and better participatory processes. The second component focuses on developing an ecosystem approach to the fisheries management plan, strengthening the implementation of regional plan of action to combat IUU fishing, assessing marine and land-based pollution, establishing and supporting the management of marine protected areas, and developing a regional plan to enhance marine turtle protection. And the third component focuses on improving the monitoring of the ATS region and sharing knowledge gained from the project. Through the three components, ATSEA-2 aims to achieve its main objectives in the ATS to foster sustainable development in the region by improving the quality of life of its inhabitants through restoration, conservation, and sustainable management of marine coastal ecosystems for a better life.
Thank you. So the map here is to show you where Arafura and Timor Sea region is. It's the one in dark blue, and where we work in our beneficiaries countries like Indonesia, Timor-Leste, and Papua New Guinea. In Indonesia, we have 3 sites in Rotendao district in East Nusa Tenggara province, Aru Islands district in Maluku province, and Merauke district in Papua province. In Timor-Leste, we work especially in the southern coast from Municipio Popalima to Manofahi, Manatuto, Fikeke, and Lauten. Lastly, in Papua New Guinea, our site will be in South Lai district, Western province. And in these sites, we work to address 5 transboundary issues identified during the first phase of ATSEA. And those are unsustainable fisheries, modification, degradation, and loss of habitats, marine and land-based pollution, climate change impact, and key species loss. Next, please. And this is how our program looks in more details. As mentioned in the video, there are 3 components. The first one focuses on regional governance and has 4 outcomes: establish regional and national mechanism, strengthen institutional and human resource capacity, better understanding of climate change impacts, and updated transboundary diagnostic analysis, strategic action program, and national action programs. In the second one, in the second component, it focuses on how to improve Arafura and Timor Sea carrying capacity and ecosystem services, and has 4 outcomes: improve management of fisheries and coastal resources, reduce marine pollution, conserve coastal and marine biodiversity, integrated coastal management, incorporating climate change adaptation implemented at local level. The last one focuses on knowledge management with only 1 outcome, improve monitoring of ATS status and dissemination of information. So in total, we have 3 components, 9 outcomes and 23 outputs. Next slide, please. And the Stakeholder Partnership Forum, or SPF, will be developed by building on the former Arafura and Timor Seas Expert Forum and engaging a broader array of stakeholders. So not only from governments and academic and scientific institutions, but also from private sector and civil society. And SPF will then provide technical and policy advices to Arafura and Timor Sea governing body and ensure stakeholder partner participation. Next, please. That being said, the objectives of this SPF consultative webinar series are first to introduce the ATSEA-2 program and activities in enhancing sustainable development, to present the initial findings, challenges, and next steps on the studies conducted by our experts to the RSC members, potential SPF members, and general public. And this is why it's called consultative, because it's also to solicit feedback and suggestions from you to further sharpen the message and study methods. The last objective is to present SPF, its objectives and roles to potential SPF members. This was mainly covered on day 1. However, we would still like to hear your thoughts on establishing the SPF. Sorry, could you please go back? And for that, we'll circulate the survey, which link will soon be posted in the chat box. So kindly participate, and if you find it interesting to engage in ATS management, please express your interest to us. Next slide, please. Just a reminder of where we are now in the series. We're now on the 3rd day, focusing on marine biodiversity protection, the bread and butter of conservation sector. Specifically, we'll discuss how to design an MPA network presented by Dr. Alison Green and develop a regional plan of action for marine turtles presented by Dr. Nicolas Pilcher. We also have a very prominent scientist as our panelists, Dr. Alan White and Dr. Windia Adnyana. Thank you very much for finding time in your busy schedules to share your knowledge and insight with us. And as mentioned by Kiran earlier, this is a penultimate event. So please also attend our last day on sustainable fisheries. Next slide, please. Finally, before we dive into the topic, let me share with you our key activities at regional level. Dr. Green's and Dr. Pilcher's studies will contribute to the design and endorsement of regional marine protected area network and the formulation and endorsement of marine turtles regional plan of action. In addition, and more importantly, at national level, there will also be strengthening management effectiveness of existing Southeast Aru MPA in Indonesia and in Nino Sentana MPA in Timor-Leste, designation of the new Pulau Kolepon MPA in Indonesia and new MPA in Municipios Manatuto and Manufai in Timor-Leste, community activities in MPAs, such as community conservation agreements, SASI, etc., and locally managed marine areas and possible alternative livelihoods in Municipio Lawton, Timor-Leste. And that is all from me. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Please keep your eyes on us. So please see our social media and let us know. Back to you, Kiran.
Thank you so much, Mbak Casey, for providing us a clear understanding of what is ATSEA and what is important on the role of ATSEA to our people, our marine resources, and the future of our oceans. So Again, I'm very humble and honored to be participating in this important event as the moderator and surrounded by the Mahaguru or the expert in this field. So thank you so much for that. And all distinguished speaker and participant, as Cassie has mentioned, this consultative webinar series will be in a flexible manner. And as we know from the name itself, consultative. So we at the ATSEA team would like to consult and getting feedbacks from everyone here to building better tomorrow for our ocean in this region. So we are looking forward to have your active participation in this important issue. And do not hesitate to ask direct questions to the chat box or the YouTube account. And should you prefer to say it directly, just hold your questions until the Q&A sessions. All right, without further ado, I'm very excited to hear more and learn from our speakers and further feedbacks from our panelists. And before we begin, allow me to introduce you to our amazing presenters and panelists for today that I'm sure many of you may already familiar with their name, especially for those who already work in this ocean-related issue. So the first speaker will be Dr. Alison Green, the Senior Marine Scientist for MPA Network Design, also Senior Advisor for ATSEA. She is a marine scientist with more than 20 years experience, ensuring that conservation and management are based on the best available science, which is very important. And her area of expertise include designing network of marine protected areas to benefit both people and nature, coral reef, fisheries ecology, and as well monitoring. So Dr. Alison has provided scientific advice and leadership for designing MPA in 20 countries in the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, West Indian Ocean, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Wow, that's a very extensive experience, Dr. Alison. And she has also provided training in MPA network design for field practitioners for more than 70 countries worldwide. Wow, so Dr. Alison will also she's also conducted coral reef survey and the long-term monitoring in Australia, America, Samoa, the Solomon Island, PNG, Indonesia, Mozambique, the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and of course Caribbean. It seems Dr. Alison is also the travel addict. Yeah, it's very lucky that you already seen different paradise in over the world, Dr. Alison. So Dr. Green received her doctoral degree in marine biology from James Cook University of North Queensland and bachelor in zoology at the University of Queensland in Australia. And she's also received several fellowships and scholarship during her study. And currently, she's being a research scientist with the Red Sea Research Center at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, where she is examining spatial patterns in coral reef ecology and also investigating opportunity to support MPA network design in region. So prior to joining the cause, Dr. Alison is also working for the Nature Conservancy as the Senior Marine Scientist and Director at the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in Australia. Wow. So secondly, after Dr. Alison, yeah, very applause, very extensive experience. Secondly, we will also have Dr. Nicolas Pilcher, a British marine biologist based in Sabah, where he established and runs his own research and conservation agency, the Marine Research Foundation. So Dr. Nick has worked extensively on conservation projects in Malaysia and across the Indo-Pacific region, focusing his energy on saving endangered sea turtles, all the charismatic species basically in dugongs. And Dr. Nick also worked extensively with major industries to design and deliver solutions to environmental challenges we face. And they face on one of his flagship. This is very impactful. The project is introducing turtle excluder devices to Malaysian trawl fisheries, which became a legal requirement in 2017. Very impactful work, Dr. Nick. And in recent years, he has also studied impact of climate change on sea turtle in Iran, tracked turtle across the Middle Eastern region, and also during his spare time, he's a diver, a boat captain, and also a small airplane pilot. Wow, that sounds very cool, Dr. Nick. I hope I can join one of your trip somewhere to see the beautiful MPN from the above. So, and now let me also introduce you to our two panelists, which I'm sure you may already know as well, Dr. Alan White. He joined the Tetra Tech in April 2016 to serve as the Chief of Party for the USAID Sustainable Ecosystem Advance, or we call SEA project. Dr. Alan has extensive experience in all aspects of coastal management implementation. So you can all name it in all related to coastal management, research, and administration from 30 years of fieldwork. Wow, Dr. Alan, very experienced. And then he has undertaken studies on the management, conservation, ecology, and also economic of coastal resources system and around marine protected area. Dr. Alan also assisted the CTS-CFF, and actually I've been interfaced Dr. Alan during my work in technical working group and at the CTS-CFF like back in 2015. So very pleased to be in the same panel with you today. And yeah, Dr. Alan also getting his PhD from the University of Hawaii at the Department of Geography. And last but not least, our second panelist, Dr. Bagus Windia Adnyana from Udayana University. He's a sea turtle lover with more than 10 years of experience leading sea turtle program at the WWF Indonesia and 30 years leading the management of endangered charismatic and migratory marine megafauna at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, Udayana University. He is also active member of the National Committee for Marine Conservation in Indonesia to support conceptualize and orchestrate campaign for marine megafauna and their habitat. Yeah, all right, without taking much of the time, let me invite our first speaker, Dr. Alison Green, to deliver presentation on MPA network design. So Ibu Alison, you have 20 minutes and apologize in advance in case I might remind you 2 minutes before the time is up. So hello, Ibu Alison, how are you, Ibu?
I'm good, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
Here, Ibu, hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for the opportunity to share with you today how we're designing a resilient network of marine protected areas for the Arafura Timor Seas region. It's not progressing. Okay, so how we plan to do this is first of all start with a bit of an introduction about the region and marine protected areas in general. Secondly, we're going to talk about how you design marine protected area networks. And thirdly, be specific about how we're actually designing the MPA network for the Arafura Timor Seas. First of all, the region, as we've heard, the ATSEA region is the area surrounded by this blue line that includes some of the marine waters of Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. This is an area of extremely high biodiversity, being right on the edge of the Coral Triangle. And it's also a very important area for globally threatened marine megafauna. The marine ecosystems in this region provide important goods and services, for example, for food and livelihoods for coastal communities, coastal protection, and carbon sequestration. Unfortunately, there are many threats to the marine habitats and species from unsustainable harvesting, habitat loss, industry, particularly related to marine and land-based pollution, and of course, climate change. The ATSEA program, as we've heard, is a regional partnership involving the 4 countries that share this important region, where they aim to collectively manage the marine resources in the region. One key aspect of this program is designing a regional network of marine protected areas, which is what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, let's start with some definitions. What are MPAs and MPA networks? Marine protected areas are clearly delineated marine managed areas that contribute to the protection of marine natural resources. MPAs can be large and include many zones that can allow and restrict different activities. For example, here's a zoning plan from Savusi Marine National Park in Indonesia, which includes part of the ATSEA region on this southeast corner. And it has a zoning plan that allows different sorts of uses, such as tourism, sustainable fishing, and protects cultural use. So what is an MPA network? Well, it is a collection of individual MPAs that work together to achieve goals more effectively than individual MPAs can do alone. For example, here is the MPA network design for Kimby Bay, which is a network of locally managed marine areas that is designed to more effectively protect the biodiversity and fisheries in the region than each of these locally managed areas can do on their own. Why do we need to do this sort of thing in the ATSEA region? Well, there is a lot of connectivity through this region. For example, this figure shows the migratory corridors of turtles, cetaceans, and whale sharks. And as you can see, they move among the 4 countries. And so for MPAs to help protect these species, for example, by protecting their critical areas like breeding areas, we need a network throughout the whole region. Marine protected areas, particularly no-take areas, can be really powerful tools for achieving many goals, including those of the ATSEA project, particularly related to protecting key marine species, recovering sustaining species, adapting to climate change, and ensuring the prosperity of coastal people. But they only work if they're well designed and effectively managed. Over the last 20 years or so, we've been doing a lot of scientific reviews to provide better guidelines for designing these areas so they'll work effectively, and sharing this information to decision makers at different levels, for example, policy briefs for governments, practitioner guides for people on the ground, and also for local communities. This has not just been an academic exercise. We've adapted, refined, and used this approach to design MPAs or MPA networks at regional, national, provincial, or local scales in many places around the world. So what I'd like to do now is talk about how we design MPA networks so they will be effective. Excuse me. To do that, I'd like to talk about the project where we supported the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries in Indonesia through the USAID project to develop a framework and apply this framework to design MPAs and MPA networks in Indonesia to benefit both people and nature. We did many things in this project. One of the key aspects was that we developed a very simple guide, framework, and example for field practitioners regarding how to better design MPAs and MPA networks so they work effectively. This guidance will be a supplementary document to support the technical guidelines for ministerial regulation on establishing and managing MPA networks. This framework, this document includes this very simple framework on how to do this in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia has a very big commitment to establishing MPAs, and they have 3 main steps in their process. There's the initiation step, establishment, and then management with a feedback to initiation. The MPA design process takes place in this initiation section. We have clarified that what we really need to do is 5 key steps in the science process. The first one is we need to define very clear goals and objectives so we know what we want the MPA to achieve. Secondly, we need very clear design criteria which tell us exactly how to design the network so it will achieve its goals. Thirdly, we need to then go through and systematically compile the data we need to apply those design criteria. And when we have all of this, we can actually do the MPA or MPA network design. And we can do that using sophisticated design software such as Marksan or through participatory mapping with local communities. Once we have it, we use performance indicators to make sure it's going to achieve the goals. Now, as we do this, we make sure that we consider all aspects that are important here. Biological, physical, socioeconomic, and cultural considerations are all important in the way that we do this. Once again, this is not just an academic exercise, but we've actually used this to design MPAs and MPA networks at regional, provincial, and local scales in the eastern half of Indonesia. What you can see here is one of the largest and most comprehensive marine spatial planning exercises ever undertaken in Indonesia. And we did this through the ATSEA project, where we focused on designing an MPA network for Fisheries Management Area 715, which is the area included by this green dotted line, and the 6 provinces that overlap the area. The goals of the design were to protect biodiversity, support, enhance and maintain fisheries, adapt to climate change, and also, of course, supporting the needs of the local communities. This was a very intensive process using the process I just described, but we realized that when we started, there was a lot that had already been done. For example, what you can see here, these red hatched areas, these are existing and proposed MPAs that are already set aside in the marine spatial plans for each of the provinces. So what we did was essentially a gap analysis where we looked at, there's already a lot here, what is missing so that we can achieve all the goals of this network. And these are the blue areas, which are areas of interest for the provinces and communities to consider for MPAs. And most of these actually relate to protecting many deep water habitats that are not currently protected, such as seamounts. So the last thing I want to talk about is how we're using a similar approach to design a resilient network of MPAs for the Arafura Timor Seas. What progress we've made, the challenges we have, and the next steps. The first thing I want to say is we are not starting from a clean slate here. There is a lot of planning and MPAs already in this region. At the top, you can see what's already happened in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. On the right-hand side is this big comprehensive design that we just did for 50% of Indonesia's waters. And as you can see, the southern end of that includes part of the ATSEA region. On the left, you can see another very detailed, comprehensive spatial planning exercise that we did to identify a marine MPA network for the Lesser Sunda ecoregion on the southern side of Indonesia, and also Timor-Leste, taking into account their national protected area network designs of planning already in the state. Has done a lot of MPA network design, particularly regarding to establishing their Commonwealth Marine Park system, and the states have also done some of their own design. On the bottom right, you can see the results of the National Marine Conservation Assessment that we helped the Papua New Guinea government do a few years ago, which also identifies priority areas for establishing MPAs. So you can see there's a huge amount of work already done. When you put this all together in a map for the ATSEA region, what you can see here are the red are the existing MPAs in the region, the yellow are the proposed MPAs in Indonesia, and these are areas that are already set aside for MPAs in the provincial plan. And the blue are some of the areas of interest we've identified for establishing new MPAs through previous planning exercises in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. These are areas where we would consider establishing new areas to help fill gaps in the network, such as habitat representation or protecting critical areas. Some areas of interest have also been identified in other areas, such as Australia, which we also plan to incorporate. The way we're going to do this is we're going to use that same 5-step scientific process we used in Indonesia. And I'm going to walk through each of these steps with you now. Firstly, we need to define the goals. Well, actually, these have already been defined for us by the ATSEA-2 program. So we'll be designing a network to achieve some of the ATSEA program goals, including protecting key marine species, recovering sustaining fisheries, restoring degraded habitats to for sustainable provision of ecosystem services, adapting to the impacts of climate change, and ensuring the prosperity of the local people. Now, to do this, we need very specific design criteria, which are guidelines that say, if you want to achieve those goals, you have to do it this way. Now, latest science and best practices advises 2 types of design criteria, and we will use those. For example, one set of criteria are biophysical. And there are many of these, and they're aimed at achieving ecological objectives by taking key biological and physical processes into account. Like I said, there are many of them. They generally relate to such things such as the need to protect 30% of each major habitat in no-take zones, and at least 3 examples of each of these. The need to protect critical, special and unique areas, for example, turtle nesting areas or where there are endemic species. The need to incorporate connectivity, and for example, I've already shown you this map showing that many rare and threatened species move throughout the region. This is also important for protecting fishery species. We need to protect healthy areas and avoid local threats where possible, but also we may be able to identify areas where local threats can be managed to assist with rehabilitation of those areas. And finally, the need to adapt to changes in climate and ocean chemistry. Equally important, if not more important, is the need to take socioeconomic and cultural aspects into account. And there are many design criteria relate to this, which are particularly aimed at maximising the benefits and minimising costs to local communities and sustainable industries. These aim to do certain things such as, where possible, establishing MPAs in areas that are supported by the local stakeholders, particularly where they can maintain increased goods and services, particularly to support community welfare. We want to allow for multiple environmentally friendly uses, ensure fair and equal access to and uses of marine fisheries resources, and support cultural practices that align with the conservation's sustainable management goals, and protect marine heritage sites such as cultural or traditional areas or shipwrecks. The next thing we need to do is compile the data that we need to apply the design, and we've almost completed this. To do that, we've sought advice, data and input from many sources. My colleague Yusuf works for Yakan in Indonesia, and they already have a lot of the data that we've used to design MPAs in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. Many of the other NGOs and Sea Project have contributed data also. The PEMSI project has supported a lot of regional data. We've worked with government representatives and scientists in each of the 4 countries to gain what data and information they have and to seek their advice. We've also had what we've done so far reviewed at the ATSEA Regional Technical Workshop recently, and we're working with the ATSEA specialists to make sure that we incorporate the work they're doing, particularly regarding climate change vulnerability, turtles, marine pollution and fisheries. So far, we've collected about 80 spatial data layers and refined and validated them. About 2/3 of these relate to biophysical aspects such as oceanographic, habitat or species data. 26 relate to socioeconomic or cultural aspects such as the location of traditional or important areas, uses and threats. Just to give you a quick look at what some of these data layers look like, here's some of the oceanographic data, sea surface temperature and chlorophyll A on the top and currents on the bottom. Some of the shallow and deep water habitats, which are important features to protect in the network. On the left, you can see the shallow water features such as corals, coral reefs, mangroves, seagrasses. And on the right, you can see the many deep sea features such as seamounts and canyons, etc. Here are some of the maps of some other important features to protect. For example, both of these maps show important ecological areas to protect, such as migratory corridors, turtle nesting beaches, important areas for seabirds, dolphins and dugongs, for example. It also shows some important social, economic and cultural areas for consideration, such as tourism areas, dive sites, shipwrecks, Aboriginal heritage areas and native tidal areas. These maps show the sorts of uses and threats in the region. On the right, you can see a regional map showing important fishing grounds. And on the left, you can see many of the uses and threats that we want to avoid when we're placing marine protected areas to avoid conflict with these areas. They are oil and gas concessions, of which of course is a major industry in this region, international shipping lanes, military areas, and so forth. So this is where we're at. Up to now, we have gathered the data. We've sought some advice from governments and scientists. We've had what we're doing reviewed. At the moment, we're in this process of steps 4 and 5, designing the MPA network and using performance indicators to evaluate it. And we hope to complete our first draft of the design by the end of this month. In December, we plan to present the draft for review by government representatives and scientists in the countries. By February, we hope to have a final design taking into account all of the advice that we have received, with a final report in April. So what will the MPA network design look like? Well, it's going to look a lot like the map that we already have that shows existing and proposed MPAs, plus some areas of interest for establishing new or expanded MPAs, possibly with some more. And these will be areas that are needed to address some of the design criteria. For example, protecting habitats. In particular, our preliminary analysis has shown us that while many coastal habitats are well protected, many deep sea habitats are not. Protect some other special and unique features, both ecological, socioeconomic and cultural. Once we've done the map, we'll provide it for consideration for the ATSEA countries, recognising that they will be the decision makers in what happens in their waters. So there are a lot of challenges for doing something like this. The biggest one being that we have just a limited time and resources to do this, just a few months. And a process like this normally takes years. So we really only have time to do a scientific analysis using the best data and get some advice from governments and scientists in the region. So really what we see is that we're really only producing what we imagine will be, or we hope will be, the first step in a regional collaboration among the 4 countries to design an MPA network for the region. Other challenges is that some data that we need to apply the design criteria are not available or in very low spatial resolution. In particular, some of the critically important information about the needs and interests of the local communities is not available at this scale. So what we hope is that any areas of interest that we identify will then be identified for the countries and provinces and states to work with the local culture and people to make sure their interests are addressed. Of course, like everyone, we have some challenges related to COVID. For us, it has been that we had hoped to validate some of the data layers more locally, particularly in data deficient areas in Indonesia and Timor-Leste, but we weren't able to do that. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you the approach that we're taking here. And we really hope that you have a better sense of what we're trying to do now, and look very much forward to hearing your comments and thoughts and suggestions. Terima kasih, obrigada, and thank you.
Terima kasih Ibu Alison Green for sharing with us your experience in very sharp time, Ibu, and it's really great to hear from your expertise in how we design resilient MPA network in the clear steps, Ibu, and how it can apply also for ATSEA region. I have a quick note on my after learning your discussion in how this region is really high in terms of the biodiversity and will benefit our existence as well for human beings, and how we now this region receives several challenge, and how designing this, how well design will predict the success as well for this MPA. And I love how you putting the importance of the scientific process in designing and taking all the aspects to be very comprehensive in taking the biophysical, social, economy, and cultural consideration as well into account. So yeah, we need to know the goals and how we can achieve the goals by have a better design. Thank you so much, Ibu Alison. And moving on to our next speaker, we will have Dr. Pilcher, the marine turtle expert, to deliver the marine turtle study in the next 20 minutes. But before we moving on to the next presenter, I would like also to remind all of you here that we have quiz. So let us know if you heard, and also let us know if you heard any inspiring quotes from our presenters. Do not forget to put in the Facebook and take a program at ATSEA, and we will have the nice prize at the end of this webinar. Yeah, all right. And I know everyone excited to learn more from Dr. Nick. So Dr. Nick, the time is yours.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope it's good afternoon for most of you. And welcome, friends and colleagues and new friends and new colleagues. And we have a lot to cover. And I thought I'd just present where we've reached at the moment in terms of looking at the development of a regional action plan for marine turtles in the Arafura and Timor Seas. Interesting. Okay. So I'll just briefly go through these 4 main topics. What we know, and you'll see in parentheses so far, because for us this is still a work in progress. We haven't finished all of the research we are supposed to do, and also touch on some of the things we don't know, particularly because of there's a word for this, the feedback that we're looking for from participants. And then basically when it comes to the regional action plan, I'll just touch on some of the basic concepts, how it will look, and some of the guiding principles that we will use in putting that together. And I haven't got as far as Alison with a next steps plan, so you can all excuse me for that. So what do we know? Actually, we know quite a bit. We're not starting from zero in the slightest. We know that there are 6 species of turtles that use this area, some of them more than others, and they're used both for feeding and for nesting, and also there are migratory routes through the seas, and not necessarily just amongst the 4 participating countries, but also in and outside of that region. Okay, so there are extensive areas where turtle nesting has been documented and reported. You'll notice that there's a big, huge chunk of those along the Australian coast and less so along other areas. And I'm going to just make sure it's clear that what this means is that this is data that is reported and publicly available. There's probably a whole bunch of other data out there that's still not as publicly available or on some of the public sites such as State of the World Sea Turtles and Obis CMAP. We know there's migrations of a number of turtles through this region, as you saw from the maps Alison presented as well. You've got loggerheads moving through, flatbacks, green turtles, and there's movements not just within these seas, but also movements outside of these seas. And Ricky posted an image just a little while ago of an interesting case of a green turtle that was tagged up here in Malaysia, where I'm based, that went all the way down to sort of the southern part of West Papua. So quite a long 2,500 kilometer migration. There's quite a lot of really good work that's been done in terms of tracking out of Australia. So there's some really good data such as that by Michelle Thumbs and colleagues looking at foraging ground areas used by flatbacks. And then there's a very good accumulation of data globally in the State of the World Sea Turtles database that looks at movements of all of the species. I've just shown the examples of satellite telemetry of loggerheads in this case, but you can see that there's quite a lot of movement in and out of this region. Less in terms of nesting for greens in this region, not less in total numbers, but probably just less in terms of the number of rookeries that are reported. There's a lot less information available for the Indonesian and Timor-Leste sites than there is for the northern coastal Australia. You can see here where there's some really good data on sizes of flatback rookeries in the Arafura Timor Seas. It just goes to show that there's a lot of data that is available. There is some data available for Timor-Leste, and it's slowly, there is more, but it's only very rudimentary, and I'll get to some of the challenges with this data from Timor-Leste in a little bit later on. But you can see here that there's aerial survey data that depicts sea turtles in the waters around Timor-Leste, and that data was also done over a period of time. So you've got actual timing of when these sightings are seen, which helps identify where and when things are happening. We know that there is traditional take of sea turtles in the region and just on the outside of the region. Probably not as well documented as we would like, but there certainly is information on this. Sorry, There's movement of leatherbacks down into the region, not a lot. The majority of leatherbacks from West Papua are migrating over north and to the east, but there is a small number of those that have come down south into the Arafura Sea. There's tracking of olive ridleys that have come down into the Arafura Sea, and similarly there's tracking of olive ridleys from the Australian Northern Territory as well, Western Australia. So there's some good data on movements. There's quite a lot known in terms of population structure, in terms of maturity for some of the areas, and similarly there's quite a lot known about the genetic population structure. In this case I'm showing greens, but there's a similar map for flatbacks and for hawksbills. So there's quite a lot known in terms of identifying genetic structure and therefore connectivity or the lack thereof. We know there's movements of hawksbills from outside of the region into the region, and there's also movement of hawksbills within the region as well. Again, you'll notice that there's quite a lot more information on nesting, foraging, population structure, genetics, etc. For the Australian side, there's a lot less information available on movements of turtles from Timor-Leste and from the southeastern part of Indonesia. So just don't, I'm not trying to suggest that that's the only thing that's known. There's obviously there's more, and there's a limited time to present, but I thought I'd give you some examples of data that does exist for the region, and then try and look at some of the things that don't exist. And these are some of the challenges in putting together a adequate management plan that doesn't require the collection of loads more data. Unfortunately though, except for in the Australian rookeries, we don't have very good long-term data series on sea turtle stocks in any of the other places. Aru has some data points that are just, they go back many years, but then they stop for multiple years, and there's points sort of like 20 years apart. And this is one of the biggest problems for the region, is not having some of these long-term data series that would allow us to understand a little bit more about population trends and whether or not those populations are doing well or whether they're doing poorly. And this is significant because if the population is doing well, then that would drive a completely different approach to management than if the population was in trouble. Another thing is that while we know a lot about nesting sites in Australia, we know a lot less about those in southeast Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste. And while we continue to seek data on these things, there isn't a lot that's publicly available, and we will continue searching. Similarly, in terms of overlaps with sea turtle populations, we know there are some studies, don't get me wrong, but there's not a lot of concrete data on overlaps between fisheries and sea turtles that we have been able to find just yet. We will obviously continue to explore that area. But this is one of the big worries, is not having information on what's happening on the high seas, and not having information on what's happening in some of the lesser studied areas. Some other things that we don't have concrete data on for the whole region is impacts of things like ghost nets, movements of sea turtles between these countries, and also from these countries and outside of the region. The example of the turtle from Malaysia that I pointed out is only one, but there are turtles moving in and out throughout this region that is worthy of consideration, because when we look at management, if we are protecting sea turtles and managing them effectively, within the ATSEA region, but then they're being decimated outside of that through some other activities, that's something that is directly relevant to the action plan and how we continue to manage that. There's, at the moment, a limited understanding of what sort of management capacity there is in some of these very remote areas, and whether or not the capacity exists for communities and local management authorities to be involved and to be able to implement portions of this action plan as it develops. Impacts of climate changes, and I don't mean only temperature. There's been some studies on impacts of temperature on nests in places outside of the region. But it's not just about temperature, it's about frequency of storms, it's about erosion, loss of nesting habitat, loss and degradation of foraging habitat, and these are some of the unknowns at the moment. Similarly, there's limited data on the magnitude of traditional hunting and take within the ATSEA region. We know that it happens, but determining a magnitude for that and possibly trying to understand what number of turtles are being taken out of the population on an annual basis would be extremely important information to have. In some areas, turtles are protected, in some areas they're not, and so there is the potential for poaching of turtles and eggs. And then there's very little known on reproductive output and hatching success, reproductive success in the other smaller nesting sites outside of Australia. These are just some of the unknowns, just to give you an idea of where some of those gaps are going to lie. So to move on to discuss the basic concepts of what this regional action plan would look like, I was involved in the development of the regional action plan between Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines for the Sulu-Sulawesi Seas, and I envisioned this plan taking on a very similar look. It builds extensively on the regional action plans developed by IUCN and also on the Conservation and Management Plan of the Indian Ocean Southeast Asian MOU. It would just be a very wasteful approach to develop a management plan that just went completely in opposite directions to those. Having these countries as signatories to the IOC MOU also makes sense, so that the idea would be that instead of having all of these different action items, it would focus specifically on those that would be most useful. The action plan is more of a guiding document rather than a prescriptive, you must do this, you must do that. Understanding that capacities, resources, and numbers of turtles. So you know, what are the pressures and who needs to do the most work? That will vary. And the plan at the end of its days should be able to stand up to peer review, as in it could be sent out to peer review, and I'm quite sure that it would meet all of the expectations of a adequate management plan. Some of the guiding principles that I think are important to incorporate into the management plan. It's got to be applicable over the long term. And that means that it can't focus on trying to do everything tomorrow. It needs to be something that looks into the long term and possibly with incremental changes over years. I don't think it needs to be at all restrictive. Countries are welcome to do a lot more than what might be outlined in the management plan. Countries possibly do. It has to be comprehensive in the sense of it will need to look at the variety of different socioeconomic situations, traditional customs, cultures, traditions, religions even, and then all aspects of the turtle biology and the turtle life cycle and the varying threats that they're under. Another thing is that I think it needs to be understandable. And what I mean by that is it needs to be written in a way that can be picked up and read and understood easily, rather than being some complex technical document that makes it something that ends up on a shelf and becomes something scary for people to read, rather than something that would be helpful and useful in moving forward. It must be implementable, of course. Yes, I'm a dreamer, and I'd like to think that everything could be done at the highest level, but that's not necessarily going to be the case across the entire region. The other thing is, and this is something that I think is important to just take away, is that it need not all be done at once. And a lot of the times when designing these plans, we think of wanting to get everything done, because if not, turtles are going to go extinct tomorrow. And I'm not that way. I think that, you know, if we can do a little bit, then that little bit is already a lot better than not having done anything at all. And if next year we can do a little bit more, then we're just another step further forward. And so I want it to come across as being something that doesn't have to be done all at once, but is sort of a guiding document to where we can go, something that's acceptable to all 4 countries as well. So some of the things that will be taken into account, obviously foraging, nesting habitats, migratory routes, threats at a regional level, and then once all of this is put together, the idea is to send it back out to the countries to have input from each of the countries on how they would like to see it further formulated. So that at the end of the day, it's not a document that got written over here and got submitted, and that's something that you all have to deal with, but rather a document that we can put together a first draft and then seek feedback and input from the representatives of each of the 4 countries, so that it's something that can be agreed upon and then finally adopted and implemented. So it's a work in progress. We started recently with this work. There have been some challenges to getting some things done. Obviously, not being able to move around is one, but just a whole bunch of other things going on in the background. So I know there's a whole bunch of people out there, and if you have resources, documents, manuscripts, theses, anything that you'd like to share that would strengthen this, please email me, and we'll make sure that it gets incorporated. And with that, I thank you and pass back to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nick, for a very informative presentation and to provide us the knowledge of the important ATS region for marine turtle habitat and the best way to take this challenge and opportunities ahead for ATS regions and beyond, basically in practical and applicable manner. And as Pak Nick also mentioned earlier, that we have data issue, and we know that data is very essential, and so this is one of the biggest challenge to have better approach in also in the management in the coming future for ATS region, also the other ecoregions. Thank you so much, Pak Nick, once again for the very informative presentation, and we now will invite Dr. Alan White. We would like to hear further reflection from his expertise, the Chief of Party of USAIDC project. Well, Pak Alan is, I think, one of the most respected MPA knowledge expert. I remember during our CTI-CFF, he always led the discussion on MPA technical working group, and everyone will just like taking attention. So let's take more attention to Dr. Alan. Dr. Alan, the time is yours.
Thank you. I'll share my screen here. Okay. Okay?
Right.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to make comments on the 2 excellent presentations that just came before me. I must say that it's hard to add much to the presentation of Alison and Nick. They're both very well versed in their fields and have done a tremendous job of bringing good scientific input into the work that is starting for the ATSEA program. So probably what I'll do this afternoon is speak a little bit more from the perspective of a conservation manager and not so much as a scientist. Because of course I'm always quite concerned about the results of improving conservation, so my comments will sort of focus more in that direction. Okay, advance. My slide's not moving forward here. I don't know why.
Or do you prefer the host to support you in share your screen, Pak Alan?
The screen is shared, but it's not progressing, no? Oh, there, okay.
Moving, Pak. There you go.
Okay. So I'll start off with I looked at the overall sort of program objectives of ATSEA, and some of my comments will focus a bit on sort of the general approach of ATSEA. I only saw the 2 presentations yesterday, so I'm not spending a lot of time on details of the scientific design and Nicolas's work, which are both excellent. But one thing I noticed, what the first comment is, I think it would be good to align as much as possible with the CTI-CFF and their MPA framework system. The Coral Triangle Initiative developed a system framework for MPAs, which was endorsed in 2014, and I'm thinking that it'd be nice for the ATSEA to have a look at that and try to gain from that and maybe synchronize with it as much as possible. In terms of strengthening management effectiveness of existing MPAs, I think that's essential, and I would hope that they could build on some of the existing frameworks that exist for management effectiveness. There has been one summarized through the CTI MPAs management framework that was mentioned, but there's also several others. But I would hope that we could build on that as much as possible. In terms of designating new MPAs in the ATSEA, I think that's excellent. It needs to be fully engage the local stakeholders as much as possible. One thing that we've learned in our work over the past few years is that the more the stakeholders are involved in the initial design and development of an MPA, the more effective they will be in the long term. And of course, working at the community level is excellent in that regard, considering traditional systems, SASI, and practices that exist within the local systems, within the local jurisdictions, is very important. And then, of course, again, it's important to gain buy-in by engaging these stakeholders and looking at alternative livelihoods and things which have meaning to people in their area. Now, just quickly, I want to remind us how many marine protected areas there are across the Coral Triangle, the 6 countries. There's more than 2,000, covering about 250,000 square kilometers. But the problem with this is that we're still not very effective at conserving a lot of area. There are indicators set up for the 6 countries whereby the percentage of, the target percentage of habitat that is protected is 20%. As of now, we have about 18% of our coral reef habitats within a legally protected marine protected area. The target for a percent of habitat which is in a no fishing zone or a no take zone is 10%. But as of now, we only have about 2% of our marine protected areas with no take zones. In other words, 2% of the habitat within protected areas is no take, which is a very low number. And I think this is probably an issue we need to address. Similarly, there's a target for effective management across the MPAs within the Coral Triangle countries. We're looking at least having 25% applying the criteria set up in the Coral Triangle MPA system as effective management. But as of now, we only have about 1% to 2% that are considered to be effectively managed. So I just wanted to raise that issue as something to focus on in terms of going beyond design and looking at the implementation of existing MPAs in the area. And just another kind of point to remind us about the perspective of local stakeholders on marine protected areas in the area. Now, many of us, of course, are scientists. We're looking at biodiversity conservation or supporting fisheries, sustainable fisheries. But when you ask the local stakeholders, probably one of their biggest concerns is to generate income for their own communities, for their livelihoods, maybe food security, and then developing a quality of life or maintaining a quality of life within their communities and for themselves. So we always need to keep that in mind and think in terms of designing an MPA system or network, and thinking about how we engage people in that process. Now, I mentioned the Coral Triangle MPA system framework, and it's worth studying this just very quickly. It's set up, or it's sort of designed in a manner where you look at individual MPAs, and then maybe look at local ecological or governance networks that are subnational, they're just more localized, and then possibly a national framework or a national learning network of some kind. And then at the Coral Triangle scale, or the scale of more than one country, it's being called a marine protected area system, and not necessarily being considered an ecological network, but really a system which tracks progress across all of those MPAs, and then as possible to develop ecological networks at a smaller scale. But the beauty of this system is that it has clearly defined strategies and principles among the countries that they agree on. So I think there's something to be said there for maybe how ATSEA could think about working with the 4 countries across the ATSEA region and how this is developed. And then one thing we've learned with some of our MPA work in the Philippines and also in Indonesia is that having long-term data sets is very critical. When we can show a trend over time, it really engages the government and the stakeholders in a meaningful way. Whether it's a long-term trend that shows positive results or sometimes negative results, at least people understand what's needed or what can be done. In the case of Tupataha reefs in the Sulu Sea, there's data going back to about early 1980s which show significant improvements in sea turtles, sharks, bumphead wrasses, and this has really engaged the government to add more resources to protect the area where they see that it's quite successful. This has also drawn a lot of tourists to the area, so it's a way of engaging people in the process. And I think with any MPA that has a history of data or meaningful outputs, it's good to share that so people can see the benefits for what they're doing and what the results are. So a few notes on sort of the MPA network design for ATSEA that I picked up from looking through the documents quickly. One thing to remind us all is that political jurisdictions must be considered. One thing we run into problems where even when we have an MPA that cuts across the local government jurisdiction, it makes it more complicated. And often the political jurisdictions are really the ones that are going to take responsibility for the protected areas. So it's quite important to keep political jurisdictions always in mind in designing the system or a network, whatever we want to call it. We need to be flexible in building the network. Any MPA that is beginning to function or is being supported locally is better than none. So networks cannot be too ideal. They should really be inclusive as much as possible. Of course, we should try to protect the more resilient ecosystems. I think Alison has done a great job of highlighting that. I mean, that's within the scientific design and is key. We don't always have perfect information, though, on where the most resilient ecosystems are. But when we have an indication, we should try to include those as much as possible. Also, as highlighted by Alison, the MPA network designed for fishery management areas 715 in eastern Indonesia actually offers valuable lessons for the ATSEA. There's a lot of crossover between the two. I think the system that we used to develop that network and the design process, which was highlighted, is quite key for the ATSEA and could very logically be followed and useful in the process. Probably worth studying some of the documents that were generated in that activity. Also, we have an aspiration for setting aside about 30% of our habitats into no fishing zones or no take areas, and of course, as mentioned earlier, the percentage is really quite low in many cases, and we might want to ask ourselves why that is. Sometimes I think we have too few large MPAs where it's difficult to declare a large large zone within one large MPA that's no fishing because it's not acceptable to stakeholders. In some cases, when we have more smaller MPAs, a larger percentage can be an actual no fishing zone and be acceptable to stakeholders if they're spread around in an area where it doesn't adversely affect the fishing interest as much. So it might be something that we could discuss. Also, the benefits of MPAs and MPA networks must be fully understood by stakeholders. You know, one thing we've run into in FMA 715 is that all of the design is quite robust. You know, it's quite scientifically based and probably the best that we could possibly do with the data we have. It's really not very well understood by the local stakeholders. And even the government officials, it's kind of a bit of a mystery to many of them. So it's something we need to think about how we talk about the work we do, the science that goes into it, and how it is meaningful for the people that will actually be responsible. And then a note on the sea turtle strategy. I mean, I think what Nicolas presented is excellent in terms of data. But, you know, one thing I just wanted to highlight was the need for consistent policies across the various jurisdictions. And then, you know, really well-designed education programs, because the bottom line is human behavior for how people treat their sea turtles or how they respect them or don't, you know, what they use them for, and to the extent they leave them alone. For example, in the Philippines, where I've spent a lot of time working, there's probably not a lot of good data on sea turtle nesting and even the habits of sea turtles, but there's quite a successful conservation strategy in that the government and everybody, the stakeholders, have basically made most people afraid to touch a sea turtle. There's strong laws for not capturing them, and also there's a bit of a mystique about just leaving them be in their own natural habitat. Consequently, the numbers have come back in recent years in rather significant ways. So it's just something to think about in how we deal with the sea turtle conservation. And then finally, recently I made a little presentation on the coral triangle, and there are a few things that came out which I think are quite relevant for ATSEA in terms of marine protected areas across the 6 countries. You know, the local enforcement capacity for many of our MPAs is severely lacking. So and this is something we've been dealing with in our Indonesian Sustainable Ecosystem Advanced Project, is looking at how we can build that capacity. It's crucial. Another thing is the management effectiveness systems need to be functional. We need a very consistent and functional way of measuring progress towards effective management, and you know, that's still lacking in most places. Each country might have what they think is a system, but usually it's not being well implemented. And looking at subnational ecological networks is key, sort of at a scale which is manageable by the local government system in place. So keeping that in mind so it can be a little bit more practical to implement. We see that the design science is not being fully utilized. We have good science, but it's not well understood yet and not really utilized at the local scale. And another thing is synchronizing databases for tracking progress. You know, each country may have a database or may not, or even local governments, but they're not being synchronized properly for tracking progress across the area. And then finally, in the Coral Triangle, marine tourism is thought of as a possible contribution to expanded fees and funding for the MPAs, which engages stakeholders, local governments, and also brings revenue for managing and patrolling or enforcing the rules in the area. So these are just some key points that have come up in recent discussions, which that might be useful. So with that, I just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to make some comments, and there's a lot of good material out there on marine protected area networks across the region. Alison and Nicolas certainly have access to much of that and have shared it, and our various websites that we support through the projects have good information if you're interested in more, and I hope that we can have more discussion. So thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alan, for your very insightful feedbacks and inputs to the subject on conservation management perspective, to be well understood by all stakeholders, and very happy how you emphasize also the local knowledge in designing the MPN to get more local buy-in and engage the wider local community. And next, we will also listen the feedback from Dr. Ida Bagus Windia Adnyana. But before that, I just would like to kindly, gently remind to the all participants to also rename your Zoom account with name_institution. And if for those who hasn't filled the survey or other, feel free to fill the survey. And also, again, this is a live in YouTube, so you can also share this to your colleagues. Yeah. And without further ado, we will have Dr. Ida Bagus Windia Adnyana. Bapak, can I also tell you, inform you, Pak Guswin? Can I? Yeah. Can I? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, Pak Guswin, please deliver your comments and feedbacks to the speakers. Thank you, Pak Guswin.
Okay. Thank you, Arina. Yeah, actually, I don't have any comment because I believe when Dr. Nicolas Pilcher is there, the turtle should be okay, should be all right. And probably what I will share is old information that to refresh us. Perhaps some of the data need to be renewed. Next. Okay, first of all, what we know, I'm borrowing the term that from Dr. Nicolas Pilcher. This area, Arafura, I'm talking about Arafura, is a very important area. And most of the fisheries in Indonesia is come from this area. And then this probably, the area is most busiest ocean in the region, in which more than 12,000 ships per year fishing in that area. Unfortunately, 70% of those fish fishing illegal. Next. And based on my knowledge, I understand at least 3 species of turtle, hawksbill, green, and olive ridley, using Arafura Sea as their feeding ground. Turtle from Raja Ampat, for example, come down to Arafura Sea. Also, other part in the bird head of Papua, and also from Palau in the Pacific, using Arafura Sea as the feeding ground. This is probably important when we deciding the marine protected area network. Next. So far, probably we only know one that used to be one of the largest sea turtle rockeries in the region. I believe if we keep searching, I think we will find another nesting beaches that is surrounding this region. We know Southeast Aru, they have what is a distinct genetic stock. Some old reference says that this area harbored used to be the largest rockeries, but now the information that's come from the field workers, the turtle that nests in that area only limited in one island only, which is Pulau Enu, as compared to 3 to 4 islands when my colleague Kiki Detmer is still visiting that area around 10 years ago. Next. Yeah, this is the bad thing. This picture is taken 3 years ago. It's before I think before ATS-2 is initiated. Yeah, I believe the turtle poaching is still rampant in that area because the remoteness of the area. Yeah. So probably this should be, probably we have to do something on this still. The turtle not only sent to Bali, which is now very much under control, but also to other places. Yeah. Perhaps China, perhaps other places also. We should know more about this. Next. Yeah, I think because of the nature of the area, which is very rich in the fish and other natural resources. Fishing common and bycatch is very common. And we, at around 2012, while I'm still working at WWF, try to compile all the data, bycatch data. And at the Arapura Sea, bycatch from trawling is very high. I understand that at the present time, trawling is, the government tried to manage the operation of trawling in that area. But again, because of the remoteness of the area, I think we have to do something on this, at least the study, whether the bycatch is still high or already under control. Next. Yeah, on 2013, one of my colleagues, Jensen, from Australia, also working on the marine debris with Kiki Detmers. And from the turtle that stranded in Australia, the coast net, most of the turtle can be stocks, but a lot of turtle also cannot be identified as stocks. So probably we have to do something on this also to see. This is mostly olive ridley turtles. Next. Yeah. This is my experience on working on sea turtle. Usually we will have, we will have a very nice plan when we still got the budget on that, when we still have the funding on that. But when the funding is cheap and the problem is usually comes up again. So I believe the conservation of biodiversity should be seen as a never-ending activities. And when we see this as a never-ending activities, then the key for success is when we are able to educate our local community to do it when we finish to do it. The government can be promoting a good policy, but without enforcement, those policies will not work. Yeah, I think that is from me. If I have some information also. Some papers, old paper that I can share or send to Dr. Nick to improve probably when it's needed. Thank you, Kirana.
Thank you so much, Matur Suksma, Bagus, for your comment and input. Truly appreciate that. And now, I think before we have to jump into the Q&A section, I would like to call back Dr. Alison to respond to the panelists. Dr. Alison, you have 5 minutes, and then continue to Dr. Nick with another 5 minutes to respond to the panelists. The floor is yours, Dr. Alison. Hello, Dr. Alison, are you there? Yeah.
Hello.
Hello, yes, please.
Oh, good. You can hear me. Thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the fantastic feedback. I couldn't agree more with Alan, particularly on some of the points he raised. One is I do think there's a lot we can learn from the Coral Triangle Initiative Marine Protected Areas system. Both Alan and I were heavily involved in that, and we saw a program start from not a lot of interaction among the countries to quite a good process that was working in the end. So I heartily agree that that's a pretty good model for a regional MPA system in many ways. One point I wanted to talk most about was the one that Alan raised that I didn't have time to talk about, and that is the role of no-take areas. So there are many different types of marine protected areas that allow different uses and so forth, but the most powerful tool we have for protecting biodiversity, enhancing fisheries and so forth are no-take areas where extractive uses are not allowed. Unfortunately, they are the hardest type of MPA or zone to get in place. One thing that we noticed when we started to do our preliminary accounting for the region is that even though there looks like there's a lot of marine protected areas in the region, very few of them are actually no-take zones. And the best science and many of the regional, global and national commitments and scientific advice is now that we should have 30% of each of the major habitats in no-take zones. And we are a long way from achieving that in the ATSEA region. Unfortunately, we couldn't do any accounting against no-take zones because the zoning plans are not available for some of these areas. But I totally understand and hear what Alan says. And while it looks like we have a lot of MPAs in the region, there's a long way to go in establishing no-take zones. Another thing that our accounting has told us that so far there's a lot of focus on shallow water habitats, but the biggest gaps remain in protecting the deep water areas. Another thing that Alan raised that I thought was very important is, yes, it's absolutely important in my mind that what we do supports and is supported by local stakeholders. That is not something you can do when you design an area at such a regional scale. These things need to be step by step and progressive. What we're doing is just the first step here, a big picture analysis of what we have and what we think we may need to do this effectively for the region. But what we will come out of this is, as I mentioned, just areas of interest where there may be areas that need to be considered for new MPAs, but we have not been able to take into account at that big regional scale what the needs of the local people are. So I see these as a two-step process. We do the regional analysis. It identifies areas where more MPAs may be needed to achieve our objectives of protecting biodiversity, sustaining fisheries, etc. But that the next step is then to go and work with the communities in that area to understand what their needs and interests are, if the area really will provide the benefits we think, and have that happen. But coming back to the point before is that I think our biggest challenge is actually achieving the design criteria related to having at least 30% no-take areas in marine, in each of the major habitats, and we're a long way from that. So I would really welcome discussions with the relevant countries in terms of whether they are committed to those targets, which are now 30% being talked about as a global target for conservation and biodiversity, and also for the CTI. So it would be really good to start a dialogue with the countries if they're committed to having those sort of at least 30% of no-take zones for each habitat. And if so, how we actually get to that target, or at least do a lot better than we're currently doing. Even 20% would be fantastic. So I think the point here is that we're at the very early stages and we've got a long way to go. Another point that Alan raised is that with the climate, we really want to do as best as we can, but there's so little data available, particularly where any more resilient habitats might be. And for that, we're very pleased to be working with the climate change specialist for the project, Dr. Joanna Johnson, who's doing a climate vulnerability risk assessment for habitats and species. And we will take that into account. But as Alan mentioned, we've got a lot to learn about how climate's going to affect these areas and how we address that in MPAs. So thank you very much for your excellent comments, and I will leave all the turtle related issues to Nick.
Yes, Dr. Nick, the floor is yours. I think you're still unmute, Dr. Nick. Dr. Nick, would you please unmute your voice? All right. Okay. I think you're still unmute, Pak Nick. Would you mind to unmute yourself, or maybe the committee or the host can help?
Yes, that's what. Yes.
Here we go.
Hey, you weren't letting me unmute myself. You didn't want to hear me.
Here we go, Panik. The time is yours.
Thank you. So thank you, both Alan and Windia for your comments, and I certainly appreciate that we, you know, in just in a 20-minute presentation, we barely scratch at the surface. One of the things that we're looking at doing in the very near future is to start consulting with the national fisheries agencies and other NGOs in the countries to try and pick up on some of that bycatch data that, for instance, WWF Indonesia has, very, very useful information. And then we can overlay that with fishery pressure and number of fishing vessels and potentially look at what those risks are. The other thing that I think was key to come out of this, and it was right at the end of Windia's comments, and that is the involvement of local communities in this. Because of the remoteness of most of the region, if we don't have local communities on our side, you're right, as soon as funding dries up, then that's the end of involvements by governments, and therefore everything could fall flat on its face. So the challenge then comes with how do you assign, or how do you provide value to turtles, value of turtles to local communities? So if, for instance, in a country, turtles are fully protected and they're not allowed to be touched, and that might go against local traditional practices that have been going on for a long, long time, how do we reconcile those differences? How do we reconcile the perceived value or the perceived value loss to a local community when a sea turtle gets protected and now is no longer accessible? And this is one of the biggest challenges, I think, in bringing on local communities, is how are they about to see value? And I could explain the process in Malaysia where sea turtles are fully protected, and getting fishermen involved in conservation is a challenge because they're not allowed to eat them. They're not allowed to eat their eggs. And if they catch one, they're in trouble. And so, you know, everything is negative. There isn't a positive anywhere on that entire equation. And this is a challenge. The more remote the areas get, the greater that challenge becomes, especially when there's a lack of capacity for enforcement and a lack of capacity for continued monitoring and evaluation. So I am fully in agreement that how we involve local communities in very, very remote areas is going to be critical. And I think that in contrast to some of the other management plans that exist out there, the idea is to try and see how we can break this down to be something that's manageable at the local level, rather than implementable by a big government agency or a well-funded NGO. So for me, I think those are key points. And the other point that I was thinking about is how do we align the conservation aspirations that we have. You know, all the people that are sitting at this table today, virtual table, have that same conservation mindset, and that is not the mindset of the people that are living day to day in these communities. There are people that are fishing, they need to eat. There are people that are utilizing coastal resources and they've done so for multiple generations. And so I think that a key component of any future management is going to be the need to fully take on board the aspirations of those local communities and what they want to get out of management rather than what we want to get out of management. And I think I'll leave it at that without getting too complicated, but certainly there are data sets out there that you know we still haven't got our hands on. Information resources, please feel free to share so that when we do develop this, it's developed with the very best and latest information. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alison and Dr. Nick for your further comments. And just to reiterate that what Pak Nick was mentioned with the great power comes to great responsibility, ya Pak, ya, in terms of this region with the great resources. It comes with a great responsibility to all of us also to manage these very highly important regions. All right, now we come to the Q&A sessions. Okay, and then I will firstly would like to give the chance to the regional steering committee members and NSU members. So please raise your hands and I will call your name. Is there any questions coming from regional steering committee? All right, if not yet, I will share some questions coming from the audience. We have a lot of questions, but first of all, thank you to Pak Ricardo Tapitupulu as well to share some additional maps as well. And yeah, we have questions coming from Pak Aryo Damar. He was mentioned that he was asking about in the ATSEA-2 working area, is there any target at the end of the project and how many hectares? So it's been actually answered by Pak Handoko, but there's also question maybe to Ibu Ali, who should also maybe share or explain your strategy to do in more details and maybe share some experience, Ibu Ali, about the obstacle to establish and make sure MPA is operating well to respond to additional response to Pak Aryo. So Ibu Ali, Alison, maybe the time is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, clear and loud.
Okay. So, oh gosh, that's such a big question. One of the, I think, some of the main obstacles for the success of MPAs, Alan touched on that earlier about making sure that even though we need to make sure they work ecologically and follow the science, that unless we do them in a way that they're supported and will support local stakeholders, they're seldom successful. And one of those reasons is if the community supports the MPA, they will help comply with it and help with enforcement. But if they don't, then, you know, it's just a terrible situation where there's enforcement forced upon people. So one of the biggest obstacles is, as Alan mentioned, working with communities and making sure that the MPAs can both support their needs and that they understand the science and why we're doing it in a way that we hope it will support their needs. There was a comment by Vera in the chat box about how it's important, for example, to help preserve traditional and indigenous cultural communities from the commercial fisheries, for example. That is indeed a big issue. And I think that is something that's probably best addressed at the next step in the process. In this big regional process, the best we can probably do is say, we need to do something over here or over here. But then when you're actually working in those areas, you need to work at that local scale and understand more about what is actually happening there. Where is the commercial fishing happening? Where do the local people need to fish? And how do we zone or establish MPAs to address all of those issues? And so this whole idea of setting up a regional MPA network is a huge, complex issue that has to be addressed at many scales and try and take all these issues into account. So that is, for me, I guess, what I see as one of the biggest failings about doing a regional MPA network design is that we can only do it with the spatial data that we can get across the region. And that means almost by definition that we can't take into account the needs of local stakeholders in each location. And that's why I always advocate for it to be a two-step process. Step one is identify areas where MPAs may need to be established or expanded, and then you go to that place and understand what's really happening there to make sure it's designed the right way. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Ibu Alison. So, Pak Aryo Damar, is it answer your question? You can also unmute yourself if you have additional or follow-up questions.
Thank you so much, Ibu Alison. Yeah, I just would like to share because ATSEA-2 working area consists of 3 countries, And in Australia, maybe have different system in developing of new MPA compared to what we have in Indonesia, for example. And in Indonesia, we have in 2014 a new autonomy law which conferred or transferred the authority of marine area from the municipalities or regency waters into area into provincial government. And this is a big challenge. Is sometimes take a long time to transfer from local government, from regency authority into provincial government. So sometimes in 3 years it's been neglected. Nobody takes care of this MPA, for example. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Can I just say that I completely understand what you're saying. I was working in Indonesia when that was happening, and I could see how difficult the transition is. One of the things that we're been trying to do with the planning we've done in Indonesia so far is support the way of the future, which is the provinces will be doing this, and in particular taking into account the provincial marine spatial plans and which areas they have and have not set aside for MPAs, and identifying which areas may be useful, and then trying to work with the communities and local government in those areas to see if there is support for them being established. So I hear you, it's a very difficult situation, and there's no substitute to working with stakeholders and governments at all levels. So thank you for your comments, very true.
Thank you, Pak Aryo and Ibu Alison. So there another question from coming from Ibu Ingrid. It's also for Ibu Alison. So even it's already partially mentioned by Pak Aryo, but Ibu Ingrid was asking, will the management effectiveness of existing MPA in the ATS region will be assessed as well, and what tools or what tools can be used, Ibu Alison?
Okay, you can still hear me, right? I will start this off, and then I'd like to ask Alan White to chip in. So we will not be able to take management effectiveness into account in our MPA network design, although we would like to. But what I do believe is that there's two key pillars of successful MPAs. One is having a good design, so we know it will work ecologically and support the people, but two, making sure it's actually being managed effectively. And there is a whole nother process in place for supporting management effectiveness of MPAs. There's global, there's regional ones for the CTI, each country have them. And for example, I know Indonesia has some. Alan, if you can be unmuted, perhaps you could talk more to your experience about management effectiveness, since I think you're probably the one who knows most about that on this call.
Well, thanks, Ali. Yeah, I think maybe an opportunity might be to look at the existing management effectiveness system that exists for Indonesia, and also the one for the Coral Triangle Initiative. There's actually a set of very simple management effectiveness guidelines that was adopted by the 6 countries. And this is intended to be applied for existing MPAs. It's not so much for the design of a new MPA network, but looking at the existing MPAs and then trying to help them qualify the condition of their management and how they might make improvements in the work they're doing. So something ATSEA might consider is just to look at the existing MPAs, do a simple evaluation, and then share that and sort of get a dialogue going about how to improve management across those areas that are within the region. And the principles that were in the CTI MPA system framework actually are easily applied across country borders. They're not highly specific or targeted to particular localities, but can easily sort of enhance the quality of management of an MPA, and then share sort of lessons learned across the borders or across MPAs.
Thank you so much. So moving on, we have now another question coming from YouTube, from our colleague in Timor-Leste, Mr. Saturnina Pinto da Silva. So his question is how to minimize the risks of losing marine biodiversity at local level, and is tourism sector is important? Yeah, he also acknowledged tourism sector is important, but what is the advantage to the marine biodiversity? So it's coming from Dulcena, Semento, Victor. Maybe we can start from Dr. Nick to answer this and continue with Dr. Alison. Dr. Nick, please.
Yes, thank you. If I get the question correctly, is what role does tourism play in, or can tourism play in minimizing biodiversity conservation? I hope I'm understanding this correctly. And the answer is, notwithstanding current COVID-19 situation and the lack of tourism, but actually tourism can play quite a large role in biodiversity conservation, because it helps provide some of those values that I was mentioning earlier to local communities in terms of potential homestays, transport, boats, guides, that sort of thing. So some responsible local tourism that builds on the resources, the natural resources that exist in an area, can be a very, very strong, powerful motivator to local communities in remote areas to protect or to manage, better manage this marine biodiversity that we're concerned about. Of course, these things come with a series of challenges as well. Anybody can tack the word eco to the front of tourism and hope that all of a sudden now that's something that would be acceptable across the world. And the world is learning very rapidly that there are these hoaxes and there are these fake ecotourism programs. And so, you know, and given the ability for widespread communications via internet, and reputations can be made or broken overnight. So I think it's going to be an important component of how conservation moves forward, but not the only component. It has the potential to provide revenue and to provide support to local communities, but at the same time, it has the potential to get way too big and unmanaged, and in those situations to become quite a detriment to wildlife conservation. And one example of that would be what is seen in a number of countries with sea turtle hatchling releases. And so we have programs where people will keep sea turtles and hatch the eggs, and then they'll release them with a whole bunch of tourists coming around. And invariably those are done at the wrong time of day, under the wrong conditions. And while everybody goes home with a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling inside, most of those hatchlings probably run down into the ocean to their death. So any of these programs need to be extremely, extremely carefully designed around the biology and the needs of the species in question. We've heard about guidelines for responsible whale shark watching, cetacean watching, and there aren't as many good guidelines around sea turtle watching as there probably could be. But I think that with the right approach, tourism can be a very powerful tool, but it runs the risk of overrunning interest to the point that economy decisions take preference over wildlife conservation decisions. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Nick and Dr. Alison. Do you have additional thoughts on this? Could you still mute?
Okay, sorry, can you hear me now? Okay. I think that Nick has covered the tourism aspect quite well. I think the other part of that question, if I understand it correctly, is what is the risk of losing biodiversity? Well, it depends on what aspect of the biodiversity, but there are many components of biodiversity that play really critical roles in, for example, supporting ecosystem resilience or coastal protection. And if we lose those, then not only will there be significant problems for the natural systems, but to people. For example, just as one example that springs to mind is that herbivorous fish may be very important for helping maintain ecosystem resilience on coral reefs. And if they're overfished and removed, then the whole coral reef system may undergo a phase shift from coral-dominated to algal-dominated reefs. And that will mean there'll be less ecosystem services for the people who live there. So it really depends on what biodiversity you're talking about. But yes, the loss of biodiversity can have catastrophic ecosystem problems, and also that will lead on to causing problems for the people who live there. I hope that answers that part of the question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alison, and apologies for some background sound in my place because next to the mosque, but it will be end very quickly. Okay, so we have another question coming from Pak Matias from Timor-Leste, and Pak Matias, would you directly ask the question with your video on and unmute yourself? Hello, Pak Matias. Or otherwise, I will share the questions. But let me call again Pak Matias once again. Pak Matias, would you directly ask the question? All right, I will then ask. The speaker. So the questions coming from Pak Matias, perhaps considering the involvement of coastal community in science activity through report card like name or character of species, behavior, time, location, where the species is found can be considered at ATSEA program implementation on research on marine biodiversity. So maybe this is more on like program activities with the local community. And would you start by Ibu Alison and then Panik to answer this?
I'd just like to make a brief comment that that involving coastal communities in science can be a really powerful conservation tool. I've seen some great work, for example, in Indonesia, yes, but also in Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, where the communities have been involved in research such as regarding fish spawning aggregations and connectivity, and that has led to the communities protecting those critically important areas. So yes, it can be very important, as can involving the communities or some sort of co-management on aspects related to compliance and so forth. So yes, I totally agree that that can be something that's very important, whether it's as part of ATSEA's program will need to be answered by someone else.
Thank you, Dr. Alison. Dr. Nick?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, of course, especially in this particular region where many of the communities are in extremely remote areas, management is going to have to rely on their involvement and on their participation and their commitment to the process. It's going to be more so related to local communities than it is to government and regulators. And of course, the communities that are impacting turtles in the region, agreed, are not only coastal fishing communities. You have major fishing companies, you have discarded fishing gear, you have climate that hasn't got anything to do with it. And so one of the challenges is finding ways to get local communities to be interested in protecting a resource that they weren't necessarily involved in the demise of. I remember facing this very clearly in Papua New Guinea, working with local communities to protect leatherback sea turtles, where the decline in leatherbacks had occurred nearly entirely due to large offshore longline fisheries. And so it was quite a challenge to try and convince local communities to be involved in the conservation of a species that they hadn't necessarily been involved in the process that led to its collapse. So therein lies a challenge where local communities directly interact with marine biodiversity that we are trying to protect, or that the program is trying to protect, then there is a much clearer and a much more direct link. But when those links become less easy to define, that's where the challenge is with having local communities participating in and contributing to these larger conservation initiatives becomes quite a challenge.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Nick. And the questions coming from Pak Matias from Timor-Leste is actually marked the end of this Q&A session. I know there's a lot of questions still coming in, and the committee keep record your questions, so don't worry. Hopefully they will answer. And then now it's time for quiz. But before that, I just would like to remind again that this SPF, or a Stakeholder Partnership Forum, is actually open for any participant, because this is more on individual level. So please, for anyone who would like to be part of the Stakeholder Partnership Forum, to directly contact the committee or the host. All right, thank you. Now time for the quiz. Drum roll. All right, now I will have 3 questions, but please do not answer it right well until I count 1, 2, 3, and then you can answer the questions. So the ATSEA committee will give the winner a very exclusive T-shirt, and then it will ship right away to your address. So you will have a new T-shirt coming from the ATSEA. So yeah, the quiz time, be ready. I will start with the first questions regarding our discussion today on network design and RPO marine turtle. The first questions, ready? So following up on the scientific process, what is the first step for designing an MPA and MPA network? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. It's a bit. Right, coming from, okay, it's now I will stop the and then the winner will be from Pak Taranang. Coming from Pak Martin Welly. Define the goals and the objective. Oh, sorry, Pak Martin only said define the goals and objective, but Lucy, Ibu, maybe Mr. or Miss Lucy, share more details to define goal and smart objective. Yeah, we need to put the smart objective. So, well done, Miss Lucy. You will get the new T-shirt from the committee. The second questions. Yeah, the second question is, in designing an MPN network for the ATS region, how many spatial data layers have been collected, refined, and validated so far? 1, 2, 3. Hopefully no one needs some clue. Wow, very quick to Mr. Yusuf Fajarianto, 79. Yes, you get the new T-shirt, and the committee will directly contact you for your address. Wow. Pak Handoko said no. Nggak boleh Pak Yusuf. All right, the last questions for the quiz. In his presentation, Dr. Pilcher, or Nicolas Pilcher, said that loggerhead marine turtles move throughout the Arafura and Timor Sea region. What is the scientific name of the loggerhead turtle? Very easy. Okay, anyone? 1, 2, 3. What is the scientific name of the loggerhead turtles? Right, we have the winners. The winners is from Zakia from Indonesia. Kareta. Is that all right? Is that true, Mr. Nicolas Pilcher? Yeah, you got the t-shirt. All right, that's the end of the questions. We have 3 winners and the committee will directly contact you. And that's also the end of today webinar series. Thank you so much for everyone. But I would like to also remind you once again that we have quote competition. So one participant is allowed to write down maximal 2 quotes only from today's discussion. I know we heard a lot of inspiring quotes from speaker and panelists. So write it down, your quotes. Post it on your only Facebook and tag @CFB, and there will be 2 winner categories based on the best quote about the ATSEA project and the most liked post. And the winner will be announced tomorrow at the 4th day of this webinar on the 5th November 2020. And lastly, I will also encourage all participants here to attend our 4th day webinar tomorrow morning, which is the last day of this webinar series about sustainable fisheries, moderated by my friends, Mbak Dina Yunita from CTSCFF Women Leaders Forum. So thank you so much for all participants for the engaging participation. Very fantastic amount sharing in the chat box to see all the active participation and big appreciation to all our experienced speakers and panelists. Thank you so much, Dr. Alison, Dr. Nick, Dr. Alan, and Bagus. Thank you. And yeah, very pleasure and apologize for any mistake. And I hope you all enjoy the webinar and learn a lot of things as much as I do from today's speakers and panelists. So goodbye everyone and hope to see you next time. Thank you.